The fluorescent lights of Hartwell Manufacturing hummed their familiar tune as Robert Bob Sullivan cleaned out his corner office for the last time. 42 years of his life were being packed into 3 cardboard boxes, a lifetime of dedication reduced to coffee-stained reports, faded photographs, and a ceramic mug that read, "World's Greatest Dad, a Father's Day gift from better times." At 65, Bob's hands weren't as steady as they once were, but they still knew their way around the machinery downstairs. His calloused fingers traced the edge of his desk, remembering the countless nights he'd stayed late, the weekends sacrificed, the family dinners missed, all in the name of providing for his family and building something lasting. The afternoon sun slanted through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the factory floor below. Bob could see the younger workers moving with the efficiency he'd taught them, their movements precise and purposeful. He'd trained most of them himself, passing down 40 years of hard-earned knowledge about the intricate machinery that formed the backbone of American manufacturing. "Mr. Sullivan?" Jenny Martinez, his assistant for the past 8 years, appeared in the doorway. Her usually bright demeanor was subdued, her eyes slightly red. "They're ready for you in the conference room." Bob nodded, straightening his tie, the same navy blue one he'd worn to every important meeting for the past decade. "How many showed up?" "About 30 people from the floor, most of the office staff, and—" She hesitated. "Your family's here too." Through the glass partition, Bob could see his son Marcus adjusting his expensive suit jacket, checking his phone with the impatience of a man who had more important places to be. His daughter-in-law Sandra stood beside him, her designer handbag clutched tightly, her smile practiced and hollow. Their 2 children, Bob's grandchildren, sat in folding chairs looking bored and restless. Missing from the scene was Bob's wife Margaret, who had passed away 3 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. Those final months had been the hardest of Bob's life, made worse by the crushing medical bills and the cold efficiency with which Marcus had suggested they explore their options regarding long-term care facilities. The conference room had been decorated with streamers in the company colors, blue and gold, and someone had arranged for a sheet cake from the grocery store down the street. The frosting read, "Happy Retirement, Bob," in cheerful yellow letters, though the exclamation point seemed to mock the somber mood that had settled over the gathering. Bill Harrison, the plant manager and Bob's closest friend at the company, stood at the front of the room with a small wrapped box in his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to honor a man who's been the backbone of this operation for more than 4 decades. Bob felt the weight of every eye in the room as he walked to the front. These were his people, the men and women who'd stood beside him through plant expansions, economic downturns, and technological changes that had transformed manufacturing beyond recognition. Maria Gonzalez, who'd started as a line worker 20 years ago and now supervised the entire assembly department. Tom Chen, the maintenance supervisor whose innovative solutions had saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sarah Williams, the quality control manager who never let a defective part leave the floor. "Bob Sullivan started here when this place was half its current size," Bill continued, his voice carrying the weight of genuine respect. "He's seen us through layoffs and hiring booms, recessions and expansions. More than that, he's mentored hundreds of workers, many of whom have gone on to leadership positions throughout the industry." The applause was warm and genuine, filled with the respect of people who understood the value of hard work and dedication. Bob felt a tightness in his throat as he looked out at the faces of his colleagues, his friends, who had become his second family over the years. Tom Chen stepped forward with a microphone that squealed with feedback. "Bob, I remember when I was fresh out of college, full of theoretical knowledge but no practical experience. You could have treated me like just another know-it-all kid with a degree. Instead, you took the time to show me how things really worked. You taught me that engineering isn't just about calculations, it's about understanding people and processes." More testimonials followed. Maria spoke about how Bob had encouraged her to pursue her supervisor certification, even offering to cover her evening classes when the company's training budget was tight. Sarah shared how Bob had personally vouched for her when she was a single mother struggling to balance work and childcare, helping her arrange a flexible schedule that allowed her to pick up her kids from school. The stories painted a picture of a man who had built his legacy not just in production numbers and efficiency reports, but in human connections and acts of quiet kindness. Bob felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a validation of the choices he'd made and the life he'd lived. Then Marcus stepped forward. His son had inherited Bob's height, but none of his weathered humility. At 38, Marcus moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never known real hardship. His success in finance built on connections and opportunities that Bob's sacrifices had made possible. "Thank you all for this wonderful tribute to my father," Marcus began, his voice carrying the polished cadence of corporate presentations. "It's clear that Dad has made quite an impact here at—" He glanced around, as if trying to remember where he was. Hartwell Manufacturing. Bob felt a chill of apprehension. Something in his son's tone, the slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, suggested this wasn't going to be the heartfelt tribute Bob had hoped for. "My father has always been a man of simple pleasures and simple ambitions," Marcus continued, his words carrying a subtle edge that made Bob's colleagues shift uncomfortably in their seats. While some people chased dreams of changing the world or building empires, Dad was content to work with his hands, to fix machines, to manage inventory. The room had grown quiet, the earlier warmth replaced by an uncomfortable tension. Bob could see Bill's jaw tightening, Maria's eyes narrowing with protective instinct. "But the world has changed, hasn't it?" Marcus's smile grew wider, more predatory. "We live in an age of artificial intelligence, automation, global supply chains managed by algorithms. The skills that made my father valuable in 1980 are, well, they're quaint now, nostalgic even." Bob felt the words like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to wound. His son's voice grew louder, more confident, as if he was delivering a keynote address to a conference of his peers. "Don't get me wrong, Dad's had a good run. 42 years of steady employment, a pension, health benefits. He's done exactly what his generation was supposed to do, but let's be honest about what happens next." Marcus paused for effect, his eyes meeting Bob's with a coldness that seemed to freeze the air between them. "You're useless now," he said with a laugh that cut through the silence like a blade. "The world doesn't need people who understand how gears work when robots can assemble products faster and more precisely than any human ever could. It doesn't need supervisors when AI can optimize production schedules in real time. And it certainly doesn't need the kind of old-fashioned, hands-on management style that Dad represents." The silence that followed was deafening. Bob felt the blood drain from his face, his hands trembling slightly as the weight of his son's words settled over him. He was aware of his colleagues' shocked faces, of Sandra's embarrassed posture, of his grandchildren looking confused and uncomfortable. "But that's okay," Marcus continued, his tone now taking on a patronizing sweetness that was somehow worse than his earlier cruelty. "Dad can spend his golden years playing with model trains, or whatever it is retired people do. The real world will keep moving forward without him." Bob looked around the room at the faces of people he'd worked alongside for decades. He saw anger in their eyes, not at him, but for him. He saw Sarah's hands clenched into fists, Tom's face flushed with indignation, Maria's protective stance as if she wanted to physically step between Bob and his son. But what hurt most was the realization that Marcus truly believed what he was saying. This wasn't just cruelty for its own sake. It was the genuine worldview of a man who measured worth purely in terms of current market value, who saw his own father as nothing more than an obsolete piece of equipment ready for the scrap heap. Bob managed a smile. It came from somewhere deep inside him, a wellspring of dignity that his son's words couldn't touch. He looked around the room one more time, meeting the eyes of his friends and colleagues, drawing strength from their obvious support and affection. "Thank you, Marcus," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "That was illuminating." He turned to address the room. "I want to thank all of you for 42 wonderful years. This place, these people, you've been my second family. Whatever comes next, I'll carry the memory of this time with me always." The applause that followed was thunderous, defiant. It was the sound of people rejecting Marcus's cruel assessment, of workers who understood the value of experience and wisdom and human connection. But even as Bob accepted their support, he felt something hardening inside him, not bitterness but resolve. As the party broke up and people filtered back to their workstations, Bob finished packing his boxes. Bill approached him with the retirement gift, a beautiful wooden plaque engraved with Bob's name and years of service. "Bob, I'm sorry about—" "Don't apologize for him," Bob said, his voice firm. "He's a grown man responsible for his own words." That evening, Bob sat in his modest ranch-style home in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. The house felt too big and too quiet without Margaret, filled with memories of the family they'd built together. Photo albums on the coffee table showed happier times, Marcus as a boy, proudly wearing a Little League uniform Bob had coached, birthday parties and Christmas mornings when their son's eyes had held love instead of calculation. Bob poured himself a glass of the whiskey he saved for special occasions, though he wasn't sure if retirement qualified as celebration or mourning. Through the kitchen window, he could see his neighbor's house, where the Johnson family was having dinner together, their warm laughter drifting across the yard. The phone rang, jarring him from his contemplation. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. "Mr. Sullivan, this is David Kim. I work in procurement at Midwest Industrial Solutions." Bob remembered David, a young engineer who'd visited the plant several times over the past year, always asking detailed questions about their processes and quality control measures. "I heard about your retirement party today," David continued, his voice careful and respectful. "Word travels fast in our industry. I also heard about some of the comments that were made." Bob waited, unsure where this was leading. "Mr. Sullivan, I've been authorized to make you an offer. We're opening a new consulting division, and we need someone with your experience to help smaller manufacturers upgrade their operations without losing the human elements that make them successful. The pay would be competitive, and you'd have complete autonomy over your projects." Bob felt something stir inside him, not quite hope, but the first glimmer of possibility. "I appreciate the offer, David, but I'm not sure I'm ready to think about work right now." "I understand. But Mr. Sullivan, what your son said today about you being useless, he's wrong, dead wrong. And I think deep down, you know that too." After hanging up, Bob sat in the growing darkness of his living room, thinking about the day's events. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the windows of the house he'd bought 35 years ago with Margaret, when Marcus was just a toddler and the future seemed full of promise. He thought about his son's words, about the cruel laughter that had accompanied them, about the way Marcus had looked at him, not with anger or disappointment, but with something worse: dismissal. But he also thought about David's offer, about the faces of his colleagues who had stood by him, about the 42 years of knowledge and experience that couldn't be captured in any algorithm or replaced by any machine. Bob Sullivan smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow would be a new day, and he was beginning to understand that retirement might not be an ending after all. It might just be the beginning of something he'd never expected, the chance to prove that experience, wisdom, and human connection still mattered. In a world increasingly obsessed with youth and innovation, the chance to prove his son wrong. 3 days after his retirement party, Bob woke up at 5:30 a.m., just as he had for the past 42 years. His body's internal clock refused to acknowledge that he no longer had anywhere to be, no production schedules to review, no problems to solve. He lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the autumn rain pattering against the windows, feeling the peculiar emptiness that comes with broken routine. Margaret's side of the bed remained perfectly made, the pillow still holding the slight depression where her head had rested during those final weeks. Bob had thought about sleeping in the guest room. It might be easier than confronting that daily reminder of loss, but something kept him anchored to this space they'd shared for so many years. The house felt different in the mornings now. Without the urgency of getting ready for work, every sound seemed amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the distant rumble of his neighbor's garbage truck making its weekly rounds. These were the sounds of a life slowing down, of time becoming something to fill rather than something that flew by too quickly. Bob made coffee in the kitchen that Margaret had remodeled 15 years ago, choosing cheerful yellow cabinets that she'd said would brighten even the gloomiest Ohio mornings. She'd been right, as she usually was. The morning light, filtered through her carefully chosen curtains, turned the kitchen into a warm, welcoming space that still carried traces of her presence. He was reading the Columbus Dispatch when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus's name, and Bob felt his stomach tighten. Since the retirement party, his son had called twice, brief, obligatory conversations that felt more like business transactions than family connections. "Dad, I wanted to follow up on our conversation the other day." Bob almost laughed at the euphemism. Conversation was certainly one way to describe what had happened. "I've been thinking about your situation," Marcus continued, his tone taking on the patronizing quality that had become his default when speaking to his father. "Sandra and I have discussed it, and we think it might be time for you to consider downsizing." "Downsizing?" "The house is too big for one person, Dad. And honestly, the upkeep must be becoming a burden. We've found some really nice senior communities in the area, places where you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or yard work. Some of them even have activities like bridge clubs and book discussions." Bob set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "You want me to sell the house? I want you to be practical. The equity in that place could set you up very comfortably for retirement. And let's face it, you're not getting any younger. What happens when you can't handle the stairs anymore, or when you need help with daily activities?" Through the kitchen window, Bob could see the maple tree he'd planted when Marcus was 10 years old. The boy had helped him dig the hole, his small hands getting dirty as he carefully arranged the roots. That tree was now 30 feet tall, its branches providing shade for the deck where the family had shared countless summer dinners. "Have you thought about what Mom would say about selling this house?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mom's gone, Dad, and she'd want you to be practical about your future." "Would she?" Bob's voice was quiet, controlled. "Because I remember her spending the last 2 years of her life, making this place exactly how she wanted it. I remember her choosing new wallpaper for the guest bathroom just 6 months before she died because she wanted everything to be perfect for when you and Sandra brought the kids to visit. Dad, which you did exactly twice, by the way." The silence stretched between them, filled with years of unspoken disappointments and growing distance. Bob could hear office sounds in the background. Marcus was probably at his desk in downtown Columbus, making this call between meetings, treating his father's living situation like just another item on his to-do list. "Look, Dad, I'm trying to help you here. I know you're emotional about the house, but emotion doesn't pay bills or maintain property. You need to think about the future." "I am thinking about the future," Bob said, "just not the one you're planning for me." And after hanging up, Bob sat at his kitchen table for a long time, staring at the newspaper without reading it. The rain had intensified, turning the world outside into a grey watercolor painting. He thought about the senior communities Marcus had mentioned, sterile places where people went to wait out their remaining years, surrounded by strangers who shared nothing but age and circumstance. The phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed David Kim's number. "Mr. Sullivan, I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to follow up on our conversation from the other night." "Not too early at all, David. I'm a pretty early riser." "Good. Listen, I've been talking to my partners about the consulting position, and we're even more excited about the possibility of working with you. I know you said you needed time to think, but something's come up that might interest you." Bob found himself leaning forward, engaged despite himself. "There's a small manufacturing company in Akron, family-owned, third generation. They're struggling with efficiency issues and considering either major automation or possibly selling to a larger corporation. The owner, Jim Martinez, specifically asked for someone with your background." The name sounded familiar. "Martinez, any relation to Maria Gonzalez at Hartwell?" "Jim's her cousin. She recommended you personally. Said you were the best supervisor she'd ever worked with, and the only person she trusted to help a family business navigate these kinds of challenges without losing its soul." Bob felt something stir inside him, not just interest, but recognition. This was the kind of work he'd always done best, understanding people and processes, finding solutions that improved efficiency without sacrificing the human elements that made small businesses special. "What kind of timeline are we talking about?" "Jim's hoping to meet with someone within the next week or two. The company's at a crossroads, and frankly, the family's not sure which direction to go. They need someone who can assess their operations objectively, but also understand what they're trying to preserve." Bob looked around his kitchen, at the newspaper spread on the table, at the empty day stretching ahead of him. 3 days into retirement, and he was already feeling the weight of purposelessness, the slow suffocation of irrelevance. "David, tell Jim Martinez I'll drive up to Akron tomorrow if he's available." "Really? That's fantastic. I'll set up the meeting and email you the details." After hanging up, Bob felt more energized than he had since his last day at Hartwell. He walked through his house with new eyes, seeing it not as a burden to be shed, but as a foundation to be maintained. This was the place he'd built with Margaret, where they'd raised their son, where memories lived in every room and every corner. The guest bedroom had been Marcus's room until he left for college. Bob stepped inside, remembering the boy who had once covered these walls with baseball posters and model airplanes. That Marcus had been curious about everything, always asking how things worked, begging to accompany his father to the plant on weekends to see the machinery in action. When had that curiosity been replaced by cynicism? When had wonder been superseded by calculation? Bob spent the afternoon preparing for his meeting with Jim Martinez. He dug out his old portfolio, photos of process improvements he'd implemented at Hartwell, documentation of cost savings and efficiency gains, testimonials from workers and management. Looking through these materials, he was surprised by how much he'd accomplished over the years. From Marcus's perspective, he'd been nothing more than a factory worker putting in his time. But the evidence told a different story, a career spent solving problems, mentoring people, and finding ways to make things work better. That evening, he called Bill Harrison. "Bob, how are you settling into retirement?" "I'm not, actually." "Bill, I need to ask you something. Was I really just marking time these last few years? Was Marcus right about me being obsolete?" Bill's response was immediate and forceful. "Are you kidding me?" Bob, you saved this company at least $2 million in the past 5 years alone. Remember the Johnson Line retrofit? Everyone else wanted to replace the entire system, but you figured out how to upgrade it for 1/10 of the cost. And the apprenticeship program you developed? We've got kids coming out of high school and earning good wages within 6 months because of the training protocols you designed. But the automation, the AI systems can't think, Bob. They can't adapt when something unexpected happens. They can't look at a kid fresh out of school and see potential. They can't walk onto a factory floor and immediately know something's wrong just by the sound the machinery's making. That's not obsolete. That's irreplaceable. Bob felt something loosening in his chest, a knot of doubt that had been tightening since Marcus's speech. I've got a meeting tomorrow in Akron, small manufacturing company that needs help. Good for you. Bob, that boy of yours doesn't know what he's talking about. Don't let him convince you otherwise. That night, Bob slept better than he had since his retirement party. He dreamed of machinery humming in perfect rhythm, of workers moving with practiced efficiency, of problems solved through experience and intuition rather than algorithms and automation. When he woke up at 5:30 a.m., he didn't lie in bed feeling purposeless. Instead, he got up, showered, and put on one of his good suits, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because he had somewhere important to be and something valuable to offer. The drive to Akron took him through the heart of Ohio's industrial corridor, past factories and warehouses that told the story of American manufacturing. Some were thriving, with full parking lots and signs advertising job openings. Others stood empty, their broken windows and rusted facades serving as monuments to industries that had moved overseas or fallen victim to technological change. Martinez Manufacturing occupied a modest brick building in an industrial park that had seen better days. But the company's trucks were clean and well-maintained. The landscaping was neat, and Bob could see workers moving purposefully through the loading dock. Whatever challenges the company faced, it wasn't from lack of pride or effort. Jim Martinez met him at the front office. He was a man in his 50s with calloused hands and tired eyes, wearing jeans and a company polo shirt rather than a suit. Everything about him suggested someone who worked alongside his employees rather than managing from a distance. Mr. Sullivan, thank you for coming. Maria speaks very highly of you. Please call me Bob. And Maria's one of the best supervisors I've ever worked with. If she vouches for you, that means something. They walked through the facility together, and Bob felt the familiar comfort of being surrounded by productive machinery and skilled workers. Martinez Manufacturing specialized in custom metal fabrication for the automotive industry, a niche that required both precision and adaptability. The problem is efficiency, Jim explained as they stopped at a particularly complex assembly station. We're good at what we do, but we're not fast enough to compete with the big, automated facilities. We're losing contracts to companies that can produce parts faster and cheaper, even if the quality isn't quite as good. Bob watched the workers at their stations, noting the smooth coordination between team members, the careful attention to detail, the problem-solving discussions that happened naturally when issues arose. This was what automation couldn't replicate, the human ability to adapt, to communicate, to take pride in craftsmanship. Have you considered hybrid approaches? Bob asked. Ways to incorporate automation that enhance your workers' capabilities rather than replacing them. That's exactly what we need, someone who understands both sides of the equation. The consultants we've talked to want to either automate everything or change nothing. We need something in between. They spent 3 hours touring the facility, discussing processes and identifying opportunities for improvement. Bob found himself energized by the challenge, his mind working through solutions that would preserve the company's strengths while addressing its competitive weaknesses. Bob, Jim said as they concluded their tour, I'd like to offer you a consulting contract, 6 months initially, with the possibility of extension. Your job would be to help us find that middle ground, improving efficiency without losing the personal touch that makes us special. Bob looked around the facility one more time, at the workers who reminded him of his colleagues at Hartwell, at the family photos on Jim's desk, at the evidence of 3 generations of dedication and hard work. Jim, I accept. Driving home that afternoon, Bob felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in months. The autumn landscape seemed more vibrant, the sky clearer. He had purpose again, not just a job, but a mission to prove that experience and wisdom still had value in a world rushing toward automation. When he arrived home, there was a message on his answering machine from Marcus. Dad, I've been researching those senior communities I mentioned. There's one in particular that I think you'd really like. They have a waiting list, but I know someone who might be able to get you moved up. Call me back. Bob deleted the message without returning the call. He had better things to do than plan his own irrelevance. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of proving his son wrong, not through confrontation or argument, but through the quiet demonstration of value and purpose. At 65, Bob Sullivan was about to discover that his most important work was just beginning. 2 weeks into his consulting work with Martinez Manufacturing, Bob's daily routine had transformed completely. Instead of waking up to empty hours and the weight of purposelessness, he found himself energized by complex challenges and meaningful problems to solve. The drive to Akron had become a meditation, a time to process ideas and plan approaches for the day ahead. The October morning air was crisp as Bob walked through the Martinez facility, noting the changes that were already beginning to take shape. He'd started with simple observations, workflow bottlenecks, communication gaps, and inefficient tool organization. But his recommendations were beginning to show results. At the main assembly station, workers had reorganized their tools according to a system Bob had adapted from lean manufacturing principles he'd learned over decades at Hartwell. The change seemed minor, keeping frequently used tools within arm's reach, grouping related items together, marking locations clearly, but it had already reduced assembly time by 12%. "Morning, Bob," called out Teresa Santos, the lead assembler on the automotive parts line. She was a woman in her 40s who'd been with the company for 15 years, and she'd initially been skeptical of bringing in an outside consultant. "You've got to see this." She led him to a station where workers were installing dashboard components for a major automaker. "Remember that alignment issue we were having with the bracket assembly? The one that was causing us to reject about 8% of units?" Bob nodded. It had been one of the first problems he'd tackled, a seemingly minor design flaw that was creating major quality control headaches. "We tried your solution yesterday. Look at this." Teresa pulled up a quality control chart on her tablet. 0 rejections in the last 2 days, and the assembly time dropped by 6 minutes per unit. Bob felt the familiar warmth of a problem well solved. The solution hadn't involved expensive new equipment or complex automation, just a slight modification to the fixture that held the component during assembly, combined with a minor adjustment to the installation sequence. "More importantly," Teresa continued, "the guys on the line understand why it works. They're not just following new instructions, they get the logic behind it." That was the key difference between Bob's approach and the automation consultants Jim had spoken with previously. Rather than replacing human judgment with programmed responses, Bob focused on enhancing human capabilities, making workers more effective rather than obsolete. Jim Martinez appeared at Bob's shoulder, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Bob, you've got a call in my office. Someone named David Kim." In Jim's office, Bob took the call while Jim handled paperwork at his desk. David's voice carried an excitement that immediately got Bob's attention. "Bob, I've got news. Word about your work at Martinez is spreading faster than I expected. I've got 3 more companies asking specifically for you. A textiles operation in Youngstown, a precision machining shop in Toledo, and a food processing plant outside Cleveland. Bob set down his coffee cup. 3 more. All family-owned businesses facing similar challenges. They need someone who can help them compete with larger, more automated operations without losing their identity. And Bob? They're willing to pay premium consulting rates for the right person. After hanging up, Bob stared out the window at the Martinez parking lot. 6 weeks ago, he'd been cleaning out his office, listening to his son dismiss him as obsolete. Now, he was being asked to help multiple companies navigate the future of American manufacturing. Good news? Jim asked, looking up from his paperwork. Potentially. David's got more companies interested in consulting work. Jim's expression grew serious. Bob, I need to ask you something. Are you planning to leave when our contract is up? The question caught Bob off guard. I hadn't really thought that far ahead. Because what you're doing here, it's not just consulting. You're helping us preserve something important. My grandfather started this company in 1952. My father grew it through the 60s and 70s. I've been trying to keep it alive through globalization and automation and every other challenge that's come along. Jim stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the factory floor where his employees were working with the focused efficiency that Bob's improvements had helped create. I've got 43 people on payroll, Bob. Most of them have been here for years. They're not just employees, they're neighbors, friends, family members. When those big consulting firms told me I needed to automate 70% of my operation, they weren't just talking about replacing machines. They were talking about replacing people. Bob understood the weight of that responsibility. He'd carried it himself for decades at Hartwell, making decisions that affected not just production numbers, but families, communities, livelihoods. What you've shown us is that we don't have to choose between efficiency and humanity. We can compete with the big guys without becoming them. But I need to know, are you committed to seeing this through? Before Bob could answer, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus's number, and Bob felt his chest tighten. He'd been avoiding his son's calls for the past 2 weeks, not ready to deal with the continued pressure about selling the house and moving to a senior community. I should take this, Bob said apologetically. Dad, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for days. I've been working, Marcus. Working? Dad, you're retired. What do you mean working? Bob took a deep breath. I mean, I've taken a consulting position with a manufacturing company. I'm helping them improve their operations. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Bob wondered if the call had been dropped. Dad, that's ridiculous. You're 65 years old. You should be enjoying your retirement, not chasing after some fantasy about still being relevant. The word fantasy hit Bob like a slap. He looked out at the factory floor where workers were implementing solutions he'd developed, where efficiency was improving daily, where a third-generation family business was finding ways to thrive in an increasingly challenging market. It's not a fantasy, Marcus. I'm good at this work. I'm making a real difference. Dad, listen to yourself. You're like one of those guys who can't admit they're past their prime. It's embarrassing. People are probably humoring you because they feel sorry for you. Bob felt something cold and hard settling in his stomach. Is that what you think? That people humor me out of pity? I think you've spent 40 years in a bubble, Dad. You've never had to compete in the real world, never had to prove yourself outside of that little factory environment. And now you're trying to convince yourself that your obsolete skills still matter. Through the office window, Bob could see Teresa Santos explaining the bracket assembly improvement to a new employee. He could see the pride in her movements, the satisfaction of someone who understood her work and took ownership of quality and efficiency. Marcus, let me ask you something. What exactly do you do for a living? You know what I do. I'm a financial analyst for Morrison Investment Group. But what do you actually do? What value do you create? I analyze market trends and investment opportunities. I help clients maximize their portfolio returns. So you move money around. You don't make anything, don't fix anything, don't solve problems that affect real people's lives. You manipulate numbers on a computer screen. That's not... Dad, that's completely different. The financial sector is crucial to what? To making rich people richer, to creating bubbles and crashes that wipe out working families' savings? Bob could hear his son's breathing getting faster, more agitated. He'd struck a nerve, found the soft spot in Marcus's professional confidence. At least I work in an industry with a future, Marcus shot back. At least I'm not desperately clinging to the past. The past? Bob's voice remained calm, controlled. Marcus, this morning I helped solve a problem that will save a family business thousands of dollars while preserving jobs for 43 people. Yesterday, I designed a process improvement that will help them win a contract they thought they'd lost to overseas competition. What did you do? Move some numbers from one column to another. Dad, you don't understand modern business. I understand that every dollar your investment firm makes comes from companies like the ones I help. I understand that when automation destroys communities and eliminates jobs, your clients profit while real families suffer. I understand the difference between creating value and extracting it. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses, heavier, more loaded with implications. Dad, I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to save you from making a fool of yourself. No, Marcus, you're trying to convince me that I'm worthless so you can feel better about treating me like I am. But I'm not worthless. I'm not obsolete, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make you more comfortable. Bob hung up without waiting for a response. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear or sadness, but from the adrenaline that comes with finally speaking truth that has been suppressed too long. Jim Martinez was standing by the window, pretending not to have overheard, but clearly aware that something significant had just happened. "Family?" Jim asked quietly. "My son," Bob said, running a hand through his graying hair. "He thinks I should be in a senior center playing bingo instead of working." Jim nodded thoughtfully. "My dad went through something similar when he handed the business over to me. Some people think aging means becoming irrelevant. They're wrong." Bob looked out at the factory floor again, watching workers move with purpose and skill. "Jim, to answer your earlier question, yes, I'm committed to seeing this through. This work helping companies like yours, it's not just a job. It's proof that experience still matters." That afternoon, Bob threw himself into his work with renewed intensity. He spent hours with the quality control team, developing new inspection protocols that would catch defects earlier in the process. He worked with the maintenance crew to create a preventive care schedule that would reduce machine downtime. Most importantly, he listened to workers' concerns, to supervisors' suggestions, to the rhythm of the factory itself. By the end of the day, Bob had outlined a comprehensive improvement plan that would increase efficiency by an estimated 25%, while actually creating 2 new positions rather than eliminating existing jobs. It was the kind of solution that proved automation wasn't the only path forward, that human intelligence and experience could find ways to compete that preserved both profitability and community. As he drove home through the darkening Ohio landscape, Bob felt a satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. He was tired, but it was the good kind of tired that comes from meaningful work well done. His phone buzzed with a text message from David Kim. "The Cleveland food processing plant wants to meet next week. They're offering a 6-figure consulting contract." Bob smiled, remembering Marcus's dismissive laughter at the retirement party. "You're useless now," his son had said. The words still stung, but they no longer carried the weight of truth. Bob was many things. Older, greyer, perhaps more set in his ways, but useless wasn't one of them. When he arrived home, he found an envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a brochure for Sunset Manor Senior Living Community, along with a handwritten note from Marcus. "Dad, I've arranged for you to tour this facility next Wednesday. It's time to be realistic about your future. I'll pick you up at 10 a.m. Bob crumpled the brochure and tossed it in the trash. Then he walked through his house, Margaret's house, their house, seeing it with fresh eyes. The kitchen, where they'd shared breakfast for 35 years. The living room where they'd watched Marcus take his first steps. The workshop in the basement where Bob still had tools and equipment from his early days at Hartwell. This wasn't a burden to be shed or a problem to be solved. It was the foundation of a life still being lived, still being written. Bob poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in Margaret's favorite chair, the one by the window where she'd done her crossword puzzles and watched the seasons change in their backyard. For the first time since her death, sitting in that chair didn't fill him with crushing sadness. Instead, he felt her presence as a comfort, a reminder of the values they'd shared and the life they'd built together. He thought about the workers at Martinez Manufacturing, about the pride in Teresa Santos's voice when she'd shown him the quality control improvements, about Jim Martinez's determination to preserve something valuable in an increasingly impersonal world. Tomorrow, he would call David Kim and accept the Cleveland contract. He would begin the work of proving, one company at a time, that experience and wisdom weren't obsolete. They were essential. He would show that the choice between efficiency and humanity was a false one, that American manufacturing could compete and thrive without sacrificing the very people who made it strong. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Bob began to formulate a plan that would demonstrate his value in terms even Marcus couldn't dismiss. It would take time, careful planning, and a willingness to take risks. But Bob Sullivan was no longer the man who had quietly endured his son's cruelty at a retirement party. He was a man with something to prove, and the skills to prove it. 3 months after his retirement party, Bob Sullivan stood in the conference room of Morrison Investment Group, Marcus's prestigious financial firm in downtown Columbus. The panoramic windows offered a sweeping view of the city, glass and steel monuments to the modern economy that his son believed had rendered men like Bob obsolete. Marcus sat at the head of a polished conference table, flanked by his colleagues, young, sharp-dressed professionals who wore their ambition like expensive cologne. They'd agreed to this meeting reluctantly, humor evident in their expressions, as they prepared to listen to what they assumed would be the quaint rambling of an old factory worker who didn't understand how the world really worked. Bob opened his laptop, a new one purchased specifically for this presentation, and connected it to the room's projection system. His hands were steady now, filled with the confidence that comes from 3 months of undeniable success. "Gentlemen," Bob began, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had nothing left to prove and everything to demonstrate, "I want to tell you about 3 companies, small manufacturers, family-owned businesses, the kind of operations that your clients typically overlook or consider obsolete." The first slide showed Martinez Manufacturing's logo and basic company information. Bob could see Marcus shifting uncomfortably in his chair, clearly wondering where this was heading. Martinez Manufacturing was losing contracts to automated competitors. Their efficiency ratings were declining, and they were considering either massive automation or selling to a larger corporation. Their annual revenue was stagnant at $2.8 million. Bob clicked to the next slide, showing a graph of production improvements over the past 3 months. After implementing targeted efficiency improvements, not automation, but optimized human processes, their productivity increased by 32%. Their rejection rate dropped from 8% to less than 1%. Most importantly, they won back 3 major contracts they thought they'd lost permanently. He could see interest flickering in the eyes of Marcus's colleagues. Numbers spoke their language, and these numbers were impressive. But here's what makes this really interesting from an investment perspective. Bob clicked to a financial projection chart. Based on these improvements, Martinez Manufacturing's annual revenue is projected to reach $4.2 million by year's end, a 50% increase. Their profit margins have improved from 12% to 21%, and they've created 6 new jobs rather than eliminating existing positions. One of Marcus's colleagues leaned forward. What kind of capital investment did this require? Approximately $15,000 in equipment modifications and process improvements. The return on investment will be complete within the first quarter. Bob moved to his second case study. Precision Components in Toledo. Similar situation, family business struggling to compete with larger automated facilities. They were considering bankruptcy. The slides showed before and after production data, quality metrics, and financial projections. The story was the same. Dramatic improvements achieved through experience-based problem-solving rather than expensive technological solutions. And the third company, Bob continued, is the most interesting of all. The slide showed Cleveland Food Processing, a mid-sized company that packaged specialty foods for regional distribution. And they were facing pressure from national competitors who could produce similar products at lower costs through high-volume automation. But they had something their competitors didn't: flexibility and quality. The challenge was leveraging those advantages. Bob's presentation showed how he'd helped the company pivot to higher-margin specialty products, implement just-in-time production systems, and develop quality standards that commanded premium prices. The result, a company that was on the verge of selling to a national corporation, is now expanding. They're opening a second facility and have become the preferred supplier for several high-end restaurant chains. Bob paused, letting the implications sink in. Then he clicked to his final slide, a summary chart that made his point impossible to ignore. Combined, these 3 companies represent a total turnaround value of approximately $12 million. Jobs preserved, 127. New jobs created, 23. Total consulting fees paid to me, $450,000. The room was completely silent now. Even Marcus had stopped fidgeting, his expression shifting from condescension to something approaching shock. Now, Bob continued, I want you to imagine an investment fund that specialized in these kinds of opportunities. Small to medium-sized manufacturers with solid fundamentals but efficiency challenges. Companies that need strategic guidance rather than massive capital infusion. Bob clicked to a new slide showing a business plan he'd spent weeks developing. The American Manufacturing Renaissance Fund, target investment, companies with revenue between $2 and $50 million. Investment strategy, acquire minority stakes, provide strategic consulting, implement efficiency improvements, then either hold for cash flow or sell at significantly increased valuations. He could see the wheels turning in their minds now, the recognition that he wasn't just talking about feel-good stories, but genuine investment opportunities. Based on my analysis of the Ohio manufacturing sector alone, there are approximately 200 companies that fit this profile. Conservatively, each represents an average improvement potential of 40% in both efficiency and profitability. Marcus finally found his voice. Dad, this is actually interesting. But you're talking about a very specialized skill set, the kind of operational expertise that can't easily be scaled or replicated. Bob smiled. It was the first time in months that his son had called him Dad, without condescension. You're absolutely right, Marcus. It can't be replicated by algorithms or automated systems. It requires decades of hands-on experience, deep understanding of manufacturing processes, and the ability to see solutions that textbook-trained consultants miss. It requires exactly the kind of obsolete, old-fashioned knowledge that you said was useless. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Bob could see Marcus processing the implications, recognizing that his father had just outlined a business opportunity that directly contradicted everything he'd said about obsolescence and irrelevance. Robert Chen, one of Morrison's senior partners, spoke up for the first time. "Mr. Sullivan, what kind of capital requirements are we talking about for a fund like this?" "Initial fund size, $50 million. That would allow for investments in 20 to 25 companies with enough capital for both equity purchases and operational improvements. Based on my projections, the fund could achieve returns of 25 to 30% annually." Bob clicked to his final slide, a detailed financial model showing projected returns, risk assessments, and exit strategies. The beauty of this approach is that it creates value for everyone involved. Investors get strong returns, companies become more competitive and profitable, workers keep their jobs and gain new skills, and communities preserve their economic foundations. The presentation was over, but Bob remained standing at the front of the room, letting his words sink in. He watched as Marcus's colleagues exchanged glances, their expressions showing the kind of excitement that comes with recognizing a genuine opportunity. "Mr. Sullivan," Robert Chen said slowly, "would you be interested in discussing this further? Perhaps over lunch?" "I'd be happy to discuss it. But I should mention that I've already had preliminary conversations with 2 other investment groups. There seems to be significant interest in this approach." Bob began packing up his laptop, moving with deliberate calm, while chaos erupted around him. Marcus's colleagues were already pulling out their phones, presumably to schedule follow-up meetings and begin due diligence. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, staring at his father as if seeing him for the first time. As the room began to empty, Bob found himself alone with his son. The silence stretched between them, heavy with months of unspoken tension and resentment. "Dad, Marcus started, then stopped, seemingly unable to find the words. "You what, Marcus?" "I owe you an apology. What you just presented, it's brilliant. It's exactly the kind of innovative thinking that creates real value." Bob studied his son's face, looking for signs of the condescension that had characterized their recent interactions. Instead, he saw something he hadn't seen in years: genuine respect. "I was wrong," Marcus continued, "about you being obsolete, about your skills being worthless. I was thinking like a typical financial analyst, seeing only what could be automated or digitized, missing the human elements that actually drive success." Bob set down his laptop bag and sat across from his son. "Marcus, what happened to you? When you were a kid, you were fascinated by how things worked. You wanted to understand every machine, every process. When did you start believing that human knowledge and experience were worthless?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city skyline. "I think it was business school. And then working in finance, where everything's about efficiency and scale and eliminating human variables. We're taught to see people as costs to be minimized rather than assets to be developed. And is that what you see when you look at me? A cost to be minimized?" "No," Marcus said quietly. "I see someone who understands value creation in ways I never learned. Someone who can look at a struggling business and see solutions that wouldn't occur to me or any of my colleagues." Bob felt something shifting between them, a tentative bridge being built across months of distance and disappointment. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. When you stood up at my retirement party and called me useless, it wasn't just an insult. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of what creates real value in this world. Money doesn't create value, people do. Experience doesn't become obsolete, it becomes refined. I know that now, Marcus said. And Dad, I want to be part of this fund if you'll have me. Not as the lead, you should be the managing partner, but as someone who handles the financial structuring and investor relations. Bob looked at his son, seeing past the expensive suit and polished demeanor to the boy who had once helped plant a maple tree in their backyard. That depends, Marcus. Are you interested because you believe in what I'm doing, or because you see a profit opportunity? Both, Marcus said honestly, but mostly because I want to work with my father instead of against him. I want to learn from you instead of dismissing you. That evening, Bob sat in his kitchen, Margaret's kitchen, with a glass of whiskey and a contract from Morrison Investment Group. They were offering him a managing partner position for the American Manufacturing Renaissance Fund, with Marcus as his financial operations partner. The house no longer felt empty or oversized. It felt like home, a place to return to after meaningful work, a foundation for the next chapter of his life rather than a burden from his past. His phone rang. The caller ID showed David Kim's number. Bob, I just heard from Robert Chen at Morrison. Congratulations on the fund approval. That's incredible. Thank you, David, though I have to admit, I'm a little nervous about working so closely with Marcus. Bob, can I tell you something? Your son called me an hour ago. He wanted to understand exactly what you'd been doing with my company, what kind of impact you'd made. He spent 20 minutes asking detailed questions about your methodology and approach. Bob felt a warmth spreading through his chest. Really? He said he'd never realized that operational expertise could be a competitive advantage rather than just a cost center. He sounded genuinely excited about learning from you. After hanging up, Bob walked through his house one more time, seeing it through new eyes. This wasn't the last chapter of his life. It was the beginning of something he'd never expected. At 65, he was about to become an entrepreneur, a managing partner, a leader in his own right. In Margaret's sewing room, now converted to his home office, Bob began drafting the business plan that would formally launch the American Manufacturing Renaissance Fund. As he worked, he thought about the workers at Martinez Manufacturing, the pride in Teresa Santos's voice, the determination in Jim Martinez's eyes as he fought to preserve his family's legacy. Tomorrow, he would call Marcus and accept the partnership offer. Together, they would build something that proved experience and innovation weren't opposing forces. They were complementary strengths that could create value in ways neither could achieve alone. Bob Sullivan smiled as he worked late into the night, no longer the man who had quietly endured his son's cruelty at a retirement party. He was a man who had taken his son's worst assumptions about him and transformed them into the foundation of a new beginning. The boy who had once laughed at his father's obsolescence would now be working alongside him, learning that the most valuable things in business, like the most valuable things in life, couldn't be automated, digitized, or replaced. They could only be earned through experience, refined through wisdom, and passed from one generation to the next. 6 months later, Bob stood in the conference room of Martinez Manufacturing, watching Jim Martinez sign the paperwork that would make his company the first official investment of the American Manufacturing Renaissance Fund. Marcus sat beside him, no longer the condescending financial analyst, but a student eager to understand the nuances of operational excellence. "You know, Dad," Marcus said quietly as they watched the ceremony, "I never understood what you meant when you used to say that making things better was its own reward." Bob looked at his son, seeing not the cruel young man who had dismissed him as useless, but the boy who had helped plant a maple tree and asked endless questions about how things worked. Do you understand now? Marcus nodded, watching as the Martinez workers celebrated their company's new partnership and secure future. I understand that some things can't be measured in spreadsheets, and I understand that the most important work isn't always the most visible. Outside, the Ohio winter was giving way to spring. Soon the maple tree in Bob's backyard would bloom again, its branches reaching higher toward the sky, its roots growing deeper into soil that had nurtured it for 30 years. Just like the relationship between a father and son who had finally learned to see each other clearly, not as obstacles to be overcome or problems to be solved, but as partners in the endless work of building something meaningful that would last. The American Manufacturing Renaissance Fund would go on to save dozens of family businesses, preserve thousands of jobs, and generate millions in returns for investors. But its greatest success would remain unmeasured in any financial report: the restoration of respect between two generations who had learned that wisdom and innovation could work together to create value that served not just profit, but purpose. Bob Sullivan was no longer useless. He was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, with exactly the right person standing beside him. The work continued, the legacy grew, and the future, for the first time in months, looked bright.